Hello and welcome to Know Where to Invest. I'm Robert Sadler. I'm the founder of Know Where to Invest, and I would like to welcome you to the very first Know Where to Invest video, the very first official video. And this will be a series of videos where I'll tackle the difficult question of where to invest during an economic crisis. Now, economic crises seem to be becoming more of the rule rather than the exception these days. And specifically, 2020, if you're watching this in 2020, we're dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic and all of the economic consequences of the response taken by governments around the world to tackle this pandemic. Now, sadly, with economic shutdowns in virtually every country, at least in every Western country, this has had a huge impact on people's livelihoods, people's careers, businesses, so on and so forth. And with that as a backdrop, it makes investment very, very complicated and very difficult, particularly for individuals. Now, Know Where to Invest is dedicated to helping ordinary people discover where to invest their savings and whatever disposable income that they want to put aside to meet their goals. So in this specific video, I'm going to be looking at a specific challenge, and that is where to find the expendable capital that allows you to invest comfortably, knowing that should an emergency arise, that you'll be able to deal with it. So by the end of this video, you will have in place a strategy that allows you to cope with that specific problem. And so what do I mean by expendable capital? Well, it's one of my clients raised this question with me not so long ago, that this was a key challenge that was holding him back from making investments. And specifically, the issue here was that he is self-employed, and during the lockdowns and the economic sort of tell that we seem to be dealing with, the economic crises that just seems to be persisting, even though shutdowns in most of the world seem to have ended, has caused him issues with in terms of being able to continue to get contracts. Now, you don't necessarily have to be self-employed to have this problem. You may well still be employed, but you may be worried about the stability of your company that you work for, and you may be concerned about perhaps being laid off. A lot of people have been laid off throughout this crisis, and it's something that happens with every economic crisis. The economy is cyclical. We have a business cycle. It has peaks and troughs. You have good times, you have bad times. And sadly, at the moment, we are in the bad times. So it may be that you're concerned you may lose your job. Maybe you've already lost your job, or maybe you're a contract worker. And similarly with self-employed people, contract workers may move from contract to contract, and it may be that your contract is about to be terminated, or perhaps you frequently change contracts, but you're finding it more difficult to get contracts at the level of income that you're used to. So with this type of situation where income is either threatened or lower than you're used to, it can make it difficult for you to make good investment decisions. And one of the particular problems that people deal with is the concern that you make an investment and your money is locked into that investment, and you can't get it back when you really need it. So this is an issue that I myself dealt with many years ago. My very first job, I worked for PwC in Washington DC, and I was sadly laid off a year after starting. Now, what I did have in place, I didn't have an emergency fund, but I did have a pension, a 401k that I'd been contributing to throughout the course of the year, and I needed that money. I needed to pay bills. My most pressing need was to pay my student loans at the time, and the thought of having to wait 40 years, for retirement to get that money, well, it just wasn't going to work for me at that moment in time. My most pressing problem at that moment in time was dealing with my current day-to-day expenses, being able to feed myself, being able to pay my debts. I wasn't worried about what I was going to do in 40 years' time at age 65. So I decided to liquidate my 401k. Now, fortunately, I was able to do that, but sadly, I had to pay a penalty in order to get my money back. And with other pensions, that may not be the case. You may not be able to get your money back at all no matter what penalty you might be willing to pay. So that's a big problem. If you've put all your money into a pension, and that's where all of your investment is, and that's where all your significant savings are, you lose your job, you need to pay bills, you need to pay a mortgage, you need to pay rent, you need to pay to feed your children. It's a big problem. So how do we address that? Well, the fundamental concept that we're talking about here when it comes to investment, the technical term is liquidity. How liquid is your investment? Now, we've just spoken about pensions. Pensions are, generally speaking, not particularly liquid. And the reason for that is that governments want to make sure you don't dip into your pension. They want to make sure that that money is there when you retire so that you don't have to go to the government to get some form of welfare. Okay, so it's a way of easing the burden on other taxpayers and placing the responsibility upon your shoulders. Now, the good thing about that is that because governments are so keen for you to put your money into pensions, they tend to make pensions very tax friendly. In some cases, you may not pay any money on the money that you put into your pension. It depends on the jurisdiction. But the downside is you can't take that money out until you retire. So this holds many people back from investing in pensions, and we might say that for the individual, a pension is probably the least liquid investment you can make. Here we're talking about money being tied up usually for decades. Now, the other end of the scale, the extremely liquid investments we're talking about, savings accounts. Now, not many people think of their savings account as being an investment, but it is. It is an investment. Typically, they don't earn very much interest. In these days, with interest rates being close to zero, or in some countries below zero, and once you take into account inflation, you're actually earning negative interest on your savings. Not a great thing. It's a problem I'll tackle in depth in later videos. But for right now, we need to consider that on the one hand, you've got pensions, which are not liquid at all, and on the other hand, you've got savings accounts, which are very liquid. And here we're talking about your ability to access your investments when you need money to deal with an emergency. So how do we address that? Well, fortunately, it's unusual that most or that any investment is going to be as liquid as a pension. Probably the most illiquid investment that you're going to come across would be real estate, and it'd be a specific type of real estate. It would be perhaps a development where you might pay to, or you might invest to build multifamily apartments, for example. Building a multifamily apartment can take usually from 12 months to perhaps 2 to 3 years. So you're not going to see any money back until you can start selling apartments. Now, most people aren't going to really get into those sorts of investments, but sometimes individuals do. And during my time in banking, I lent to people, individuals like yourselves, who were interested in real estate development. And then you've got a sort of a spectrum from real estate down to stocks, which tend to be very liquid, bonds, and the types of funds which you can buy these or invest in these types of instruments. But the way to think about all of this is, rather than think about specific investments at this time, and I will talk about these investments in detail in later videos, but more so to think about the strategy. If you have the strategy in mind, then the investments fall into place afterwards. So this is what you need to keep in mind. And the approach that I encourage people to take is think about your specific goals. What are your goals? Typically, most people have fairly similar goals. One of those most important goals is taking care of yourself once you've retired. Once you've addressed that, you can start thinking about other goals. However, there are some goals that may not be as important as retirement, but are more urgent. And what is one of those more urgent goals? It's if you lose your job, can you pay your bills? Can you pay your mortgage? Can you feed your children? That can become a very urgent goal very, very quickly when we have an economic crisis. So what do? We have separate portfolios to address each goal. So investment advisors call this a goals-based investment approach. And that's really what you need to have in mind. So the way to address that is to have in mind the amount of money that you think that you're going to need to address that specific emergency. And again, for most people, the emergencies are typically similar. Usually it's centered around losing a job, losing income. So the approach to take here would be to perhaps, if your issue is perhaps losing your job, to consider what your expenses are likely to be for 3, 6, 9 months, depending on your situation, and making sure you've got funds in place to address that situation should it come up. And then once you've dealt with that and you have that portfolio in place, you can then start to think about other types of goals, other types of portfolios. So what have we done here? We've answered the question. The question is, how do I invest, or where do I invest when I'm concerned about being able to pay for emergencies as they come up? And what's the answer? The answer is to have a separate portfolio dedicated to dealing with that issue. Once that's set up, then you can start looking at the other goals. Now, if you want to hear more about that, I've written a book which covers this subject. I also have an email course available which covers the same topic, and you can access that simply by clicking on the link below and going to my website, where you can download a copy of the book and also sign on to my email list, where I'll send you out the email course. On top of that, if you liked this video, please like it. In addition, if you want to know about when the later videos are released, then please subscribe and hit the bell next to the subscribe button so that you get notified when the next video comes out. And in that video, I'll tackle this topic a little bit more in depth and talk about the types of investments that you're going to want to have in place for your emergency fund. All right, take care, and thank you for watching.